Good evening, and we are live. This is season 2, conversation number 12, and it is my pleasure to have Srinath Mohandas as our guest today. These conversations are brought to you by the Vivekananda Institute for Leadership Development, which is a unit of the Swami Vivekananda Youth Movement. And these conversations hope to bring speakers and people from a wide range of backgrounds and spanning topics of development, social issues, leadership and education, culture, heritage, and much more. And in fact, over the course of these 11 conversations, we have covered all of these topics as well. Srinath Mohandas is Assistant Professor at the School of Ethics, Governance, Culture and Social Systems at the Chinmaya Vishwavidyapeeth. Srinath is an educator with expertise in curriculum and pedagogy, developing content, designing curriculum, and teaching at middle and high school levels. He has worked closely with several schools across Tamil Nadu, catering to their academic needs, spanning curriculum, pedagogy, and teacher professional development. As a culture and value educator, he conceived and conducted workshops based on the Chinmaya Vision program as part of the school's initiative to foster cultural values. He also writes, speaks, and conducts youth workshops in various themes related to Indic or Indian knowledge systems. And at CVV, he teaches courses in Indic knowledge systems and education. Currently, Srinath is pursuing his PhD from the School of EGCS, and his research areas include the development of a pedagogic framework for teaching Indic knowledge systems at the collegiate level. An absolute pleasure to have you, Srinath, and welcome to this conversation.
Namaste, Rameshji. Wonderful to be here. Thank you. Swami Sharanam.
So I'll dive right into it. Since the NEP 2020 speaks of inculcating cultural values as part of school education. Now, and most of us know this is easier said than done. And I understand that the Chinmaya Vision program has been reflecting the spirit of NEP through its integrated unfoldment of the child across its physical, mental, intellectual, and spiritual dimensions. This is something that, even at our own institution, we've been trying that at our schools. We run CBSE schools as well as a school that is for tribals as well. So if you could elaborate on the approach and the experiences from this initiative, I think that would be a good starting point.
Yeah. So as we all know, NEP 2020 talks about a lot of things which are very interesting, which are very relevant from the Indic point of view, from the cultural point of view. It's a very well drafted document, a policy document. The vision is right there. However, as we all say, it is not about what is a vision. It is also about how do you implement it. So it is in that context we speak about Chinmaya Vision program, which we normally call CVP. I can see that a few teachers of Chinmaya Vidyalayas have also joined.
And in fact, quite a few school teachers from our institution also are on the program. So most ideal.
Yeah, I'm so glad that all of you are here. Right. So as far as Chinmaya Vision program is concerned, so there is, so these are some of the ideas about education that has been compiled together and put in a framework in 1996. So Swami Gurudev Swami Chinmayanand has not specifically spoken about education that way. He has not given a theoretical framework as such. However, from many of his talks, these things, little bits have been compiled together, and a shape has been given and detailing has been done in 96. So what we say as the Chinmaya Vision program, the 4 pillars of Chinmaya Vision program are basically it is about integrated development. Then we talk about cultural education, then patriotism, and also the universal outlook. And when we talk about integrated development, it is about the physical, emotional, intellectual, and the spiritual development of the child. I think the root for this is in this book called Self-Unfoldment. It is a beautiful book of Swami Chinmayanand. So he mentions about how there are 3 levels of an individual, and how if you don't cater to all the 3 levels of the individual is going to end up dissatisfied. So basically, he talks about the physical level and the emotional level, and which includes the intellectual aspect, and then the spiritual. And the much of the problem when it comes to education has been to address the first 2 levels and not much to the spiritual level. And so this is speaking from an individual point of view. Now, if you also consider individual as a person involved in the society, when you bring the social angle also, that is when the other three angles come in: patriotism, universal outlook, and cultural education. So all of this put together, the idea is that, so whatever we teach in class, normally all the schools subscribe to a CBSE curriculum or a ICSE or any other curriculum for that matter. Now, these are the larger frameworks. These are the components. Now, how do we integrate these components into the existing curriculum? Right. So that was a larger question. So let us take an example. Now, let us say I'm teaching something like solar system. I'm teaching about the sun to class 5 students. Now, there is, of course, certain things about sun, which, the Western world has discovered over the years. I mean, knowledge is actually universal. I don't want to call it Western, Eastern, Indian, etc. So that way, knowledge is really universal. But then we call it Western in the sense that over a period of years, over a few centuries, maybe after Enlightenment period, it has evolved. This particular knowledge has evolved from a certain base, which is a Western base, right? Now, and normally today, that is what we introduce into our classes. So while we transact the class that way, we also include the other components into it. Now, for example, something like how do you include the cultural component into it? Now, one of the things that a teacher can do is to also discuss a little bit about the Indian discoveries on Surya, like for example, something from Surya Siddhanta, and how we could also measure the diameter of the sun and things like that. So that would be much more related to the cultural aspect of it, where you also explore the scientific heritage part, that is also, which is very much embedded part of the culture. Now, another example of introducing emotion into it would be about discussing a poem on Surya, right? That is part of the culture, and how sun is not just a ball of gases, but it is also something which we are very relatable to, right? I mean, Surya is like he's a god, of course, at one level.
Right.
At another level, we are more personally connected to that. So to sum it up, the idea is to use this as a framework and use the existing curriculum so that it can be made a little more rich, right? Also, it can cater to the all dimensions of the child. I'm not explaining further, but this is a larger idea with which it works.
I got what you're saying, Srinath. I see that happening. But to make that happen, I think it would require either an individual teacher to do it, because I don't see this being either institutionalized at the level of the institutions, or being brought into practice at the classroom transaction level, transactions between teacher and children. So I can understand somebody like you who is also rooted in cultural values and other things, bringing it. But unless it is part of curriculum, how do we then mainstream it in one sense? I see the logic of it, because there is a absolute need to embed it into the education system, but our education system is not constructed in that sense to cater to this kind of education. How do we bridge that gap?
Yeah. So to start with, when you're talking about Chinmaya Vision program, it is actually quite institutionalized. Institutionalized in the sense.
No, I was just looking at broad basing it across, since it's also about NEP and other schools and other things, right? So yeah. So if you're talking from the larger perspective, broader perspective, I totally agree with you that this has to be institutional at some level. And currently, we don't have a provision for that. And the CBSE, and basically from the NEP point of view, it is they of course say that they will come out with a more detailed document on how it can be worked out. However, I think at the end of the day, it will come into the hands of the individual schools. And in many of the cases, what we see about policy documents is that it is about how do you interpret it at the school level, right? How the management interprets that particular thing. So that system is there. I mean, I would say that flaw is still available there. However, one thing that many schools can take up is follow some existing curricular patterns that are already in place. Like for example, CVP is definitely one of the patterns we can take. I'm told that this Aurobindo schools also, Auro schools also has a certain way of dealing with it. I have not fully gone into it. Similarly, KFI, Krishnamurti Foundation India schools, they are another school, set of schools who do wonderfully well. So I think these frameworks can be adopted and adapted to the individual schools, I guess. And like you said, the NEP is still at policy stage, and not really something that is rolled out in that sense across schools. So we'll have to see how. I'll just move to the next, level where, you spoke about Indic knowledge systems and, tradition. Now,
Yeah.
both of these are, so what is your definition, or what is the CVP model of Indic knowledge systems and tradition, and what is,
Yeah.
comes under its ambit? And what has been your experience of, teaching this to children and all that? How do they take it? How do you bring parents into it? I'm assuming that parents have to buy into this whole idea as well. So how do you do that?
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting question and very relevant to a lot of people ask this question, including myself. So let me put it this way. Actually, Chinmaya Vision program. When we talk about Chinmaya Vision program, we are talking from the Chinmaya Vidyalayas point of view, the school's
Right.
point of view. And the school's point of view, actually, this is not this is IKT and IKS is not that much of in conversation. Because schools follow, a system which has already been in place.
Right.
IKT and IKS, Indic knowledge traditions and Indic knowledge systems have been spoken more from the Chinmaya Vishavidyapit, the university point of view, specifically because CVV is a de novo university for IKS, and de novo means the government has authorized, or rather recognized it as a university that will be doing innovations and research in this emerging field of Indic knowledge systems. So how do we define it? So I can put it this way: IKT, Indian knowledge traditions, is the larger set, and IKS is a subset of that. And what do we mean by that? So when we say Indic knowledge traditions, we actually mean that all those traditions of knowledge, right? All those streams of knowledge that evolved in the subcontinent. And we're talking about subcontinent, not just the geographical India that we are today.
Right.
So the larger knowledge streams that evolved in this particular geography over the thousands of years and spread across the world, right? So it is more spoken from a geographical identity that way. Now, when we talk about such Indic knowledge traditions, there are hundreds and thousands of such streams, which includes, let us say, maybe the tribal traditions of medicine. It can include some other a specific community being participating. A specific community engaging in a certain way, etc. So this is larger Indic knowledge traditions. However, among the larger ambit of knowledge traditions, we also have certain traditions which are very much systematized. Systematized in the sense that it is institutionalized. There have been a set of teachers associated with propagating it. Then, what do we say? Let us say a constant research has been carried on it. Now, a best example would be all the Sanskritic traditions. All the knowledge traditions that are rooted in Sanskrit are actually institutionalized. We have a Guru Parampara. We have we have acharyas who have written commentaries on that, and somebody would rebut it, somebody would critique it, somebody would then re-establish it. So there is an active research, active teaching and learning that is happening there. So such systematized traditions we would call the systems, and therefore IKT will be a larger set, and IKS comes under that. And when we talk about Indic knowledge systems, in Chinmaya Vishavidyapit, we actually define it as the four Veda, that is Rik, Yajur, Sama, Atharva Veda, the four Upaveda, which is Ayurveda, Dhanurveda, Gandharva Veda, and Arthashastra and Stapatya Veda. So that are the four Upaveda. Then we talk about the four Upangas, that is Nyaya, Mimamsa, then Itihasa Purana, and also Dharma Shastra. And lastly, the six Vedangas, which is Shiksha, Vyakarana, Kalpa, etc., Jyotisha, all of that. So basically, this is how we have defined it as far as CVV is concerned. But as you said, there is no universal definition for IKS and IKT as we understand. But I think people like Kapil Kapoor, and these are some of the important people in the field, they more or less go in line with this.
It's very, very interesting, the subjects that you mentioned, because I'm sure Dharampal in his Beautiful Tree, in the book, The Beautiful Tree. Dharampal in his book on called The Beautiful Tree. I'm sure many people, teachers, would have read it. And whenever I meet with teachers also, I strongly recommend that they read this book. Actually mentions all of the topics that you just mentioned. Additionally, he also, and the entire book is compiled from British records, where he talks about 1 lakh schools in the Madras Presidency, 1 lakh schools in the Bengal Presidency. The whole idea being that, this rich traditional as well as rooted education was uprooted, and they wanted to the British wanted to look at the roots, and then they simply dropped the tree as it is without replanting it, and therefore the tree never grew.
Okay.
So it's very interesting that you talk of these subjects, because those are typically subjects, and it included topics that we seem to be covering today. For example, arithmetic was covered under the syllabus, science was covered in, and a lot of science discoveries that were that started from India and all of that. So it's interesting that we had this, then we've forgotten, and we seem to be coming back towards trying to establish this again. So it's like,
Rameshji, on that note, I would just like to add something. So when this whole IKS was being defined this way, we also took the cue from Vishnu Purana, where Vishnu Purana, also Manusmriti. In both these texts, we have a specific shloka. I don't remember the shloka right now, which actually lists down all the 18 abodes of. So these are the 18 abodes of knowledge, Ashtadasha Vidyasthana. And one more interesting thing I found was, if you see Kanchi Mahaperiyava, Sri Chandrasekhara Saraswati Swami, who was 68th Shankaracharya of Kanchi Peetham, if we read his book, this Hindu Dharma, the Universal Way of Life, the entire book has been classified in this framework of Chaturdasha Vidyasthana. So I think so to best of my knowledge, I think this has been in practice as far as tradition is concerned. Now we are making that shift to the mainstream education as well.
Right. Yeah, I absolutely. I think that you mentioned that the Kanchi Paramacharya's entire, this one is also available in English under the title The Voice of God.
True, yes.
Spread across 7 volumes, if people want to know. And I think it captures the whole landscape of what the Indian Indic system itself.
True.
Not just education, but there are at least 2 volumes that talk about only the Indian education system itself. The kind of the Chaturdasha Vidyasthana that you talk about. The other thing that I wanted to, quickly, I wanted to talk about is, because I want to make a little segue into something that is very interesting, because in many of the curriculum, in most of what we try to teach, we don't seem to be putting either we don't seem to put either the child, the student, or the teacher in the middle. I think they are the 2 important protagonists in that sense.
True.
And we seem to say, okay, these are the things that they have to learn if they have to clear a class, right? I mean, they have to go from 7th to 8th. This is the syllabus, or this is what children have to study to clear. But we're not looking at what. So if we could we go back and forth over what does a child actually need? So if we were to address that question, what is it that a child needs? So what would be those things if we could look at based on your several years of teaching, education, and all of that?
Yeah. So to be very honest, I think this question can be answered from multiple points of view, and I'm sure that coming from the background the person is, they will have multiple. Like for example, in a typical setup, when we ask this question, what does a child need? I think most people will say critical thinking, because critical thinking has been missing in our education system.
Been beaten to death now. So critical.
Yeah, correct. Right. We have courses on critical thinking also right now. So I'm more looking at it from a cultural point of view.
No, that's what I wanted actually. Yeah.
Yes. So my concern, and this is my personal experience and my concern, and not any theoretical position that I take. Now, my concern has been that there is a deculturalization happening in classrooms, right? And this happens mainly through the textbooks. Now, those students were blessed enough to have a family, who takes care of the culture of the family. Then I think the deculturalization is not that effective. However, if a student is actually dependent on simply on the schools and the teachers and the textbooks, then I think this happens. Now, what do we mean by this deculturalization, right? Now, whatever we see in the textbooks, it is actually not a celebration of what the child sees on a daily basis, day-to-day basis, right? I can say that over the years, maybe in last decade or so, there has been a lot of good changes. That has, because I'm sure that a lot of educators have taken note of this, and even CBSE, the national curriculums, etc., have accommodated that. But still, I would say that has not been really effective. So now, what happens is that it totally falls upon the school and the teacher to actually supplement the students with this cultural point of view. And when we talk about cultural point of view, it is not just about ensuring that they tell the truth and or they don't speak falsehood. It's not about just that.
Yeah, it's not just about morality and ethics. So
It's not about morality and ethics. Just not about values in that sense. It is also about what is identity of the child. Identity of the child. Does the child feel proud about the culture, the family values, the family orientation he or she comes from, and how is the school supplementing it or rather complementing it? So I think this cultural education part has been missing, even though many schools in their own capacities, I'm sure that, like for example, the school, what is that? Saraswati Vidya Mandirs and even the schools run by Vivekananda Kendra, schools run by Chinmaya Mission. Now every such school, such group of institutions actually make this a point and do it in their own ways. However, more or less, unless we have developed a common platform on how to do this still keeps missing, and sometimes it is not done in a nice way. So the harm is that a lot of students end up hating the culture itself because they do it in absolute wrong ways, so that the student doesn't feel connected to it, rather got alienated to it. So my experience has been that, or rather my concern is that school somewhere, the education system somewhere has become a tool to deculturalize the population of the country. That I find very alarming.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that you make. In a sense, so you get into the schools. Okay, so here is the problem. If you need to put the finger on it, we have to ground the education system in the cultural values of the country that it's embedded in.
Yeah.
So and the problem that, as I see it, is that we have a culture that has survived over several years. We are the only living civilization in that sense. Most civilizations that paralleled ours or were contemporaries of our time, of our civilization or heritage, have died away now. So in that sense, I think what has happened is we seem to have force-fit a framework that is outside of this country, into without embedding it in, or rather, giving it the foundational basis of the culture of the land, in the sense that we are not teaching children about the history. I'm not looking at the social sciences, or we'll come to that. I think that's important, because I know that you've written some social sciences curriculum. In fact, I don't even like the word social sciences, because when science is, it's my feeling, when science is appended to the as a suffix, it's usually a pseudoscience, except computer science. So, unless you have science at the beginning, so now you look at many of these things. So that is one thing. So social studies or social whatever. So I think that is the fundamental issue that we seem to be facing. We have a framework, but it doesn't have a foundation, and that's why most the deracination, the loss of roots that we seem to be facing across.
Ramesh, I'll give you two examples. Sorry to cut you over there. I just thought I'll add just a point.
No, not at all. Feel free to butt in at any time. We're just having a conversation.
Yeah, correct. So I'll give you an example of something that I felt really bad about when I heard about this. So there is a certain school. It's a residential school, very good school. A philanthropist actually runs it with the best of the intentions, and he wants well for the children and the families and all of that. So this is somewhere in Kerala, and the school has actually taken one whole village. It's like, all students in this particular village are welcome to attend the school, and they don't charge a fees also, I guess. The students' education is also taken care of. So they get the best of the facilities and, good teachers, well-paid teachers, all of it is really good. And this, I think, so over a period of time, I don't know how many years this particular school ran, but over a period of time, one of the concerns the local community, the parents actually said is that everything is good and they can't afford this kind of an education. This is international standard education. But after 6-7 years, these students stopped identifying themselves with their homes. the students somewhere don't get connected to their own parents and the values of the family, right? Because the families come from a certain background and financial background and cultural background and all of that.
Socioeconomic background.
Yeah, socioeconomic background. So the idea is that what has happened over the 6-7 years, the children has got the best education, and thanks to this person who is very dedicated and want to do well for the students. But in a way, it has alienated the child. Now the parents would definitely feel bad about it, but still they would think that, this is the best for my child, right? They still think that, okay, if this is what it takes for the child to succeed in life, then we are ready to make that sacrifice. Now, so this was the starting point of my thinking on, my line of thinking also. How are the schools, deculturizing, deracinating the children? So if we actually take it as a model and apply it to our country or last 150 years, I think this is exactly what would have happened. When initially it was the British who introduced the education system, then we didn't dismantle it. We just continued it with few changes here and there. But over a period of years, first of all, so let us say we are talking about at least 4 generations which has got deracinated. And now, what is the cap? What is the price we had to pay for it, right? So all the things we talk about, the low morale and the inferiority complex, things like that. I mean, there used to be this time in our life, like in 90s, when we will feel proud as Indians only when India win a cricket match. If Sachin scores 100, all of us are out there telling that yay, I'm an Indian and all of that. There was absolutely no. Maybe once in a while, ISRO will send a rocket, which also makes us happy and proud. But beyond that, there was nothing that we could feel proud about ourselves. So these were all various manifestations of this, this educational system at some point. And one more point with respect to this, I don't think it would be nice if we have one uniformed, centralized curriculum, because India is too big for that, one common cultural education also. It has to be specific, language based and smaller geographies and all of that. But still, we should have a loose framework, which is common minimum for everyone. I think NEP also mentions about such a loose framework, common denominator kind of thing. Yeah, that's
an interesting point. 2 things that one is, we are no longer a colony, but we continue to be I mean, our minds are we are physically free, but our minds remain colonized.
True. So, absolutely.
Decolonization is something that has not completely happened. We continue to be colonized. That is what. But I want to take up the the second part of what you mentioned. You spoke about not having uniform. Is that, did I understand you correctly? You said you can have a loose framework that defines how education should be across the country, but there must be a regional or language related kind of changes that need to happen at the state or maybe even at the local levels. So how do you see that panning out? How do you want that to? Have you thought of it or tried it out anywhere?
So from an institutional point of view, I think this has been actually mentioned in NEP, and I think it also makes sense that so they would put it in a very constitutional point of view where they say state education is a state subject, right? Concurrent, it comes in the concurrent list, so states have an equal say on this. I mean, which is absolutely right. But more than that constitutional point of view and the legal point of view, what I think is, let us say now, for example. Now Deepavali as a celebration, right? Now, let us say in Kerala also Deepavali is celebrated, of course, and it has all the cultural angle to it, and it is Rama's homecoming and Krishna, slaying Narakasura, all that is there. But Deepavali is a very, it's more remaining. It is more confined to your homes than a public social function. Like for example, as against Vishu or Onam. Right. So therefore, when many students in textbooks, when we talk about Deepavali being such a gala festival, many students, as a child, I was not able to connect to that. Right. But that doesn't mean that I don't want that celebration to happen or things like that. So I think this is where that loose structure will help. So let us say we need to talk about that basic common denominator which connects all of us. Like for example, when we're talking about festivals in India, now one common thing that about festivals in India is that all of that is God to word, right? It is all about. Everything is related to devotion. Everything is related to the larger spiritual symbolism, right? It is everything is about, you can give a lot of symbolism for all the festivals. So there is no festival called social festival that way, even though, these days we call many festivals secularized social festivals. But from the Indic point of view, all festivals are divine that way. So I think that being the common denominator. Now, according to the regions, the educators and the concerned, all the stakeholders can come together and decide, we talk about what festival that way. Now, another angle to that is that, so many of us actually felt there used to be this, I remember when as a child, 5th standard, 6th standard child, when we all sit together and discuss about things. Now, one of my friends would say, Christmas is a national festival, and I celebrate Christmas and it's a national festival. And your Onam is not a national festival; it's a local festival. It's a state festival. Now, I used to feel offended. Why is my Onam not a national festival? Then, of course, now Onam is also brought into the list of national festivals. But then, these are some of the little things. As a child, all this mattered to me, and I'm looking the same way.
You might also add that Christmas is an international festival. So.
It's an international festival. So why can't Onam be an international festival?
Why can't Onam be an international festival?
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, if the diaspora is celebrating it outside of India, it becomes
true.
Yeah. So that's an interesting thing. So you've traveled across Tamil Nadu. One of the things that I'm very interested to know is you've traveled across Tamil Nadu, across schools. So a few anecdotes or things that you picked up, teacher-student interactions or teacher-student, any interesting things that point to, cultural, whatever, any interesting anecdotes that you can share with us, perhaps?
So I generally share a couple of stories that comes to my mind. So once I was in Karaikal in Tamil Nadu. So it's actually, Karaikal is part of Pondicherry. So it's a Tamil-speaking state. Union territory. In this particular school, I was actually, a teacher is teaching class, and I was supposed to, be in that class and not exactly monitor, but just it's part of their teacher professional development. So I was assisting that, leading that particular thing. So then it is LKG class, lower kindergarten, and then students are absolutely wild, and teacher is finding a very difficult time to manage them. So there is this particular teacher who asked the students, what is the color of an elephant? So a teacher is teaching something about elephant, and then teacher shows a picture and says, what is the color of the elephant? And all children stands up and shouts, and somebody say it is green in color. Somebody says it is red in color. Somebody says one or two kids also say black in color and all of that. But there is this little girl who stood up and said, elephant is pink in color. So the teacher asked, are you sure it is pink in color? So the child says with absolute confidence, yes, elephants are pink in color because I have a couple of elephants at home. Both of them are pink. Today morning also when I came up, I saw my pink elephant. So the confidence in which this child said, there are a couple of other students who said elephant is black in color. So now the confidence with which this little girl said that, those who said elephant is black in color, they had a second thought. Okay, maybe elephant is pink in color. Okay, so they, quietly sat down. Now my question there, what intrigued me there was, now this child has this child is coming from a imaginative space, right? The child has a lot of imagination. Now, how are we catering to such a child, right? Now, let us say when we actually put this child through the same educational system that we have, unless the child is actually blessed with a couple of teachers who could identify this and, help her with supplementary, complementary training. Now, at some point of time, this imagination is going to die down. And also, it's also about her body language, the way she speaks, the way she's convinced. She actually sees the pink elephant in front of her, right? That's why she could say that. Now, that is one question that really struck me. How do we cater to such children and specific children? That is one thing I could think of.
And another, I just thought, schools are only about obedience and doing tasks, because most schools are, throughput, output systems where You make
Yeah.
the obedient people who will do as they are told when they grow older. So that is basically how schools are. So
And we actually say child-centered education, right? And child-centered education has been a big word at least last 10, 15 years. And I'm sure that many schools have actually adopted that system as well. But still, at the end of the day, if the teacher is not really convinced of child-centered education, and I don't blame a teacher for not being convinced, because enough effort has not been taken to. Of course, we have teacher training workshops and all of that, but then I understood that it requires a little more than a periodic workshops to actually help us teacher be formulate this child-centered education. So the point is, at the end of the day, it really falls on the teacher if she wants to really conduct the child-centered education the way, or even the best of the child-centered education can can be the same old didactic approach if the teacher is not well equipped to that. So I think that is something again we have to think about.
I think you are also. I broke your flow. I think you're thinking of another anecdote also. So were you?
Yeah. This is about so in one of the schools. This is, I think, 9th standard. So I was taking a class there. We were talking about natural resources. I mean, it's a social science, it's a social studies class, and we're talking about natural resources and non-renewable, renewable resources, all of that. So we talk about coal, right? This how coal is a non-renewable resource and all of that. So I remember now, as a teacher, all you have to do is just to list down these are natural and non-natural. I mean, what is it? These are the renewable and non-renewable, etc. Now, but then I was actually thinking, how do we make it interesting? And not just for the child, not just for the students, but as a teacher also, you also need, it should not be a mindless repetition of a lot of facts and things like that. So I remember telling this particular story. Actually, it was an imaginary story where I said, just think about the coal mines of Bihar or Jharkhand, places like that, where a couple comes and do this coal mining for a livelihood. And let us say in the process, I mean, as they live there, they also have a child, as the days go by. And this child is born into the coal field, right? So what does he play with? He would pick up the coal, the stones of the blocks of coal and play with it, because he has not seen a life outside that. So now think about this child who grows up entirely in this coal mine, right? From his young day. And maybe by 20, 25 years, all he would have breathed would be that polluted air, and how the lifespan would decrease. And so we are talking about an individual who was born in this coal mine, grew up there, and also went on doing this particular work, and finally died also in the same place. So it was, of course, it was said in a more, emphatic way and appealing to the emotions and all of that. And finally, the class ended by telling that, so, the electricity that we all get, it is produced from coal. Most of it is produced from coal. And then just added this line that, so let us be careful when we use electricity. Let us, say our gratitude. Let us thank all those people who actually helped it work. So that was class. So class was more about storytelling and less about actually all these renewable, non-renewable. I also asked them to please read it so that they don't miss any points that I would not have covered. Anyway, all of that happened. At the end of the day, when I was leaving the school, there was this not little boy, I mean, he was in 8th or 9th standard. So there was this boy who was not left. So this boy was actually going across the classes and looking at each class and coming out. So I asked him, you didn't leave? I mean, why are you here? I mean, the bus will start at any moment. So now this boy was telling me that I'm just making sure that all the fans and lights are switched off, because I don't want the effort of that little child who helped us with coal to go in vain. So there were a couple of other students also who did the same, who was with him. It was very touching for me because, it is beyond this renewable, non-renewable resources. This child, this particular story has touched the child. That was also, moments when I realized that what is the impact of a story and how the stories are the best pedagogical tools in the hands of a teacher. Yeah, so that is the second anecdote I wanted to share.
So and I know that you're a storyteller. I had a question framed on your storytelling, your love for storytelling, but you've already covered it. So we'll probably come to that later. Since you brought about teachers and other things, teachers in general, we often talk of or we speak of teachers not being respected, and it's something that we seem to have come to accept now. That
Yeah.
in the sense that we've come to accept in the sense that, we all agree that, teachers are not valued enough. They're not given the respect that is due to them and all of those things.
Mm.
But I also wanted to pose a counter to that. We are also, what we are also finding is that we are not getting the best people into this area. People don't want to teach unless they. I mean, I may be completely wrong, and there are several teachers, but I get a feeling sometimes that people become teachers because they did not find anything else to do or something. Many people have actually mentioned this when I've had conversations with them also. So what ails the teacher and ecosystem itself in our country now?
I think this is actually a cycle, right? The teachers are not respected enough, which will lead to the best of the teachers not to come into the system. And then, it's actually a cycle. It actually feeds onto each, I think. So one angle that I would like to bring here is that, so generally we talk about guru in our culture, right? So guru is spoken from a spiritual point of view, one who actually removes your ignorance of who you are, right? All the wrong notions about yourself. So let us say when we talk about teachers, we talk about adhyapaka, right? It is adhyapaka, adhyapika. Now, even from that point of view, teachers are generally respected in our country. However, I think after the institutionalization of the English education, the Macaulay education, the status of teacher has been reduced to the last person in the hierarchy, in the bureaucracy of education. So now you have a minister who takes care of education. Under that, there are under secretaries, and then there are nodal officers and education officers and all of that. You have a whole set of people, and finally there is a teacher at the end of the pipeline, and this teacher is actually facing the students. So now compare this to the earlier model where teacher was at the center of education. Teacher and students were, both of them are at the center of education. So there is a lot of autonomy associated with the teacher. It is the teacher who decides the curriculum. It is the teacher who delivers the curriculum. It's the teacher who understands what the child needs and reframe the education, the pedagogy accordingly. So, however, when this whole bureaucratization happened, teacher became an employee. The status of teacher has been. Yeah, excuse me.
Yeah, I think there's somebody who needs to mute.
I request everyone to please mute your audio.
Yeah, mute your audio.
Yeah, no problem.
Go ahead.
Right. So somewhere in the educational bureaucracy, the role of teacher has been relegated into this employee. And I think that is the beginning of this, this fall, I guess. There could be multiple reasons, of course, but one of this is there. Now, another way is, so this is about the bureaucracy and the institutional aspect of it. And in all policy document, we say that we will empower teacher, but how do we empower teacher? I mean, that question is also there. Of course, one is, giving the better pedagogic empowerment and curriculum and all of that. But also it is about, at the end of the day, the teacher has to be made, more autonomy has to be given to the teacher. I think that is where it all boils down to. But from the other point of view, from the individual point of view, as a result of all of this, especially in the private schools, private sector area, now let us say teaching somewhere became a stopgap arrangement. Let us say I completed my graduation and I'm writing my PSC exam. I'm writing my bank exam. I'm also applying for a lot of other exams. Or maybe I want to study further, but I want to take a break. So there, many of the individuals, came into teacher education. And schools also welcome them, of course, irrespective of them maybe having a B.Ed or, things like that, or maybe they might not be trained in that way. But again, the problem is that led to the whole feeling that so teaching is a light thing, right? I mean, at the end of the day, you can teach. You might not need that professional skill. So I think that is some lacking coming from the individual and social point of view, and the other from the bureaucratic point of view. So ideally, I think the way forward is to have good teacher profession. Teaching should be a profession like any other profession we're talking about, engineering or medicine or anything. So I think again NEP actually does a service there. Like they bring the 4-year integrated courses for teachers. So I think this will be addressed in that space. But again, it takes time, and we want the best of our minds to come into teaching.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think that
and
is
government should incentivize them, which includes better pay packages and better autonomy at the classroom level.
right. I think you touched two important points. I think one is obviously autonomy. I think that is critical because I don't think they have enough of that. And be it even in private schools for that matter. I mean, it's the
Yes.
founders and all of them who will, there also there is a hierarchy that
Yeah.
controls what the teacher. You wanted to say something.
Yeah. So one thing about the private school, we can also, I can actually empathize from the management point of view also, because at many points of time, managements will have to take such a strong hierarchical structure just to keep the school intact. So I have seen personally that happening. So to a certain extent, I'm not able to, make a complaint against the management as well. At the same time, teacher autonomy is absolutely necessary. If we have to make good children, like take this example, a teacher who is under the fear, so many teachers are actually under the fear that, they are, what is that? Let us say, I mean, accountability is a good thing. Definitely, everybody should be accountable and responsible. But then let us say a teacher who fears the higher authorities. Now, if that particular teacher goes to class, how is that teacher supposed to create individuals who are fearless? If I am, if I am afraid of something, if I'm fearful, then how do you expect me to make somebody fearless? I mean, and we want students to be fearless. That is one of the values we all want, right? So now you want to create fearless
do we
individuals.
really want it? Because I think most children are taught to be fearful of examinations. That's the 2-hour examination. They're supposed to define their entire life. So kind of so.
So that's what the documents say. The policy documents all.
Obviously.
Look at the vision statement of all the schools. They would want students to be fearless, and which is good, right? At least in the vision level, if you're clear, that is okay. But then it has also to translate down. So I have asked this to one of the managements also, somewhere I was working. Now this particular management is actually, I felt that teachers are being scared. I mean, teachers are being made to fear the same stick approach, right? I mean, I will cut your salary, I will dismiss you, and all of that. And then the same management expect the teacher to go to the class and make the students fearless. I said that's not possible.
Right.
So somewhere we need to understand this. Yeah.
Okay. So what has been the experience in I know that you've worked on structuring curriculum and all that. What has been the experience? What is the kind of autonomy that you were provided when you were working to build such kind of curriculum for structuring and all of that? And how is it been, executing it at the level of the school management or whatever? What has been the experience?
So my whole experience with curriculum design and development was when I was working with this wonderful organization called Chrysalis. It was formerly called EC Vidya Private Limited, and the brand was changed to Chrysalis. So I was working there in the R&D, research and development, and I was working in the R&D team of social studies where we developed the textbooks. So that was my whole experience with respect to this. Now, what we do there is, so this CBSE and ICSE, they actually give you guidelines. So let us say if you are if class 3 environmental studies text, so these are the 10 outcomes. What is that? These are the 10 learning outcomes. The student should have by the end of the year, right? And each chapter, now this is chapter number 1. Chapter number 1, these are the 3 learning outcomes you have to achieve. Now, so it is this is a largely loose framework, right? So it is up to the individual schools who can create textbook. Actually speaking, CBSE and ICSE and all the boards are actually giving the larger structure. Let us say I decided to start a school today, and I want to come up with my own books. I can absolutely do that under the current system itself.
Right.
Now, then what is stopping me from doing it? So, I would need to hire that kind of people who have expertise there. So I would better subscribe to whatever textbooks there are in the market, whatever publisher are there in the market. I would take one of them and then teach my students accordingly. So now the point is, so actually when it comes to the narratives, when it comes to the writing the textbook, it is up to the publisher that way. Of course, the government comes up with an NCERT textbook, which is a model textbook. If you want to take an NCERT textbook, you are welcome to take it. But there's absolutely no problem if you don't subscribe to an NCERT textbook also. You can develop your own. So now when it comes to the publisher who develops such a textbook, now that is where all this, there is a lot of autonomy. And also that is where you can either make it or break it, right? So that is the whole point. So, when I was working here, I had a very good time, in the sense that it was, so it was following a certain approach called chrysalis approach, which is at par with most of the, the modern techniques of education, both at the philosophical level and also at the pedagogic level. So that was one aspect. Yeah. So, sorry, I just disconnected from that flow. We were talking about the structuring.
Structuring of the curriculum, where you said that the boundary conditions are set. I mean, by the, and then you have the autonomy to work within those boundary conditions. I mean, this, yeah.
Right. Yeah. So now let us say we have structured a textbook on the basis of this way. We use the autonomy and structured it that way. Then now it is about implementation part. So let us say normally from the publisher point of view, how it works is that now most schools approach you and you actually approach them telling that, why this is the best curriculum that you need to implement it. And if they're convinced about it, we go forward to do that. So here the good thing is that if you can actually create a good curriculum based on the larger framework and then help the people understand, make others convinced about the quality of it, then there are lots of takers for it. So therefore, more and more people who have this idea, who have this, who are really concerned about it, should come into this field. Rather than, it's also an opportunity to make a lot of money because schools. I'm not very sure about after COVID, but pre-COVID it was a very good avenue for that. Right now, I don't know the situation. So I think that is where more and more people who are actually interested about education should step in. So this is one aspect of structured curriculum. Another thing is we also talk about the non-structured curriculum, that the curriculum is not structured, and we call them the alternate schools. These days, alternate schools are very popular. We have KFI schools, Krishnamurti Foundation schools are alternate schools. We have CFL in Bangalore, Prakriya school. I mean, we have many such schools actually. Now, one of the good things about alternate schools are that they have a more a loose curriculum, not very tight and very, very structured that way. But the flip side of that, what I find is, and a lot of parents actually go for alternate curriculums these days. Especially the more, I would say, the more socioeconomically advanced you are, the more you prefer an alternate school. But the negative part that I found of some of these alternate schools is that if the teachers there or the people associated with the school are not actually very conscious about it, they use the loose structured format of curriculum for their advantage, but do not actually supplement or rather complement it with the close monitoring and conscious teaching learning, then this can actually burst in your hands. And I've seen this happening in one of the schools where I saw this is supposed to be an alternate school, and there was, and the teacher-student ratio is like 20:1. So one teacher, 20 students. It's a very good, it's a heaven for a teacher, right? Compared to classes we had 60 and all of that. These days it is better still. But then the point is that even at 8th standard, 9th standard level, there were a lot of students who didn't have the basic numeracy, basic writing skills, basic language skills. So the point is that the structure was very loose. And in this particular school, what happened is that teachers came and went. I mean, like, for example, every year, the teachers would change. There is a attrition. Teacher attrition is very high in this particular school. So now what happened was they took the advantage of the alternate school of system. I mean, the alternate schools structure. However, they were not able to put that conscious teaching learning systems in place. And the result is that the child suffers. Right? So now,
it's swung to the other end. I mean,
it's swung to the other end.
It's swung to the other end. Where, I mean, you need to build. But what I'm hearing, and which is very interesting, is that it's possible for us to build a curriculum that can blend the cultural grounding along with the basic skill sets that are required as part of the boundary conditions that the overall the overarching boundary conditions that are there. But
yes.
Therefore, what I'm also hearing from you is that if the right people come into it, even within the current system, it is possible for us to incorporate a proper Indic knowledge system that does not deracinate our children or uproot them from their culture, but also gives them the modern learning that is required for them to be able to flourish in the new world of today. Is that?
Yes, that's absolutely right. And I think that is exactly the space where, the Chinmaya Vidyalayas and Vivekananda Kendra Vidyalayas and, Amrita Vidyalayas. And I mean, I'm sure that these are some schools I know, that's why I'm telling.
Right.
I'm sure that there are also many good convent schools who also do the similar things, even though I can't name them. So I think that is where these schools actually come in and play that very effective role. Now you have that within the larger boundary, you can actually deliver a lot of good things. So the only thing is that the teachers, the management, there should be a conscious, concerted effort, and this mapping has to be done in the right manner. The classroom mapping, the curriculum mapping, all of that at the end of the day should be done in a more effective manner. So as far as if that goes well, I think we still have now that MEP has come into place, but even before that, we really had a scope to change a lot of things.
Right, but we didn't. I mean, clearly.
Yeah, we didn't. And there's a reason why we didn't also. The reason is that assessment was a major concern. Like, for example, in 10th standard, you have a board exam. Now, I'm not against board exams, and I think there should be some structure, assess it also. The point is that by the time when you have a 10th standard board exam, by 6th standards, all the schools will shut down their alternate systems. Now from 6th standard onwards, they want to go for NCERT because you actually need 4 years to groom your child, train your child into that, right? So therefore, many of these alternate ways, many of these external publishers actually made a lot of sense till 5th standard, and all the good work you do till 5th standard will be, it will be undone from 6th standard onwards. And same old, preparing for exams thing happen. And you buy the NCERT textbook, and NCERT textbook says a list of things. So you conform to that structure. So that was the flip side of it. We actually had autonomy, but then this exam patterns actually debilitated it.
Yeah, but what I'm also hearing from you, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that even if you were to conform to an NCERT kind of textbook, it is possible for schools and to incorporate within their same, overall boundary condition, overarching boundary condition, certain aspects of grounding that can be comfortably done, but the schools have simply not done because they were so focused on what they call, covering the syllabus. I mean,
yes.
When you're expected to uncover the subjects for children to discover it themselves, we want to cover most of it so that
that's a good way of putting it. Yes.
Yeah. So,
like for example, I can give you this example. Let us say in class 6, history. I think history is introduced in class 6. Now the curriculum would say that you need to teach them something about Vedic India. The ancient India, the Vedic times. Right. Then you need to teach about the medieval age. And in medieval age, you have to talk about Mughals, you have to talk about Rajputs, you have to talk about these people. Now, to what extent is not really mentioned there, right? Okay. It is more the framework that is given. Now, nobody is stopping you to tell 3 pages about Vedic India. Right? But the textbook might only have 1 paragraph or half a paragraph of Vedic India. That's what the textbook, right? But nobody is asking you to end it there. Extend it for 3 more pages, right? So whereas some other dynasty or some other thing, you don't have, let us say there is no mention about Vijayanagara. Textbook has a mention of Vijayanagara Empire, but when we were studying, it was not there. So let us say if there is no mention about Vijayanagara Empire, there is no reason why you should not teach it still, right? But again, so that takes us to the next point, which is now textbook is something like a Bible. Right, and I use the word Bible in the sense, there is no negotiation about it, kind of, right? This is the word of the God, right? So many teachers actually take. I don't complain teachers. It is a culture that has set in our society for many decades, right? So textbook is kind of a uncompromisable word of God, and therefore I don't dare teach anything which is not there. I might teach, but then still it doesn't have the official capacity, right? I think Gandhiji also mentioned this point in Hind Swaraj. So the problem is at least 100 years old or more, right? So I think he says that he talks about the whole textbook culture. So textbook is more powerful than a teacher. Let us say I'm a teacher, I teach, And then I want to look at textbook whether it also says the same. If the textbook doesn't say that, I'll say, sorry, textbook doesn't say, so I'm wrong and this is right. So this is again, that fear psychosis that has been pushed into through the Macaulay education. So when I said nobody's stopping you from doing that, this is why most people don't do that. And many people don't know it also. I mean, that is also true. Many teachers don't know this.
Yeah, because I was not very sure till that's why I kept clarifying that it's possible for us to work within the current system also to build.
Yes.
I think we are almost out of time, so that's a good point. Yeah, it's a good positive note for us to be actually making one last segue. But I can't let you go without asking one question. What about why this interest in this bullet and the long travels that you take?
Okay. No, so I actually never wanted to buy a bullet.
Right.
I remember telling my friend that I would be happy with a moped also, because as long as it takes me from one point to other, right, I would be happy with it. But then somehow it so happened that I ended up buying it, and after that I really loved it. So after that I've been covering a lot of distance on my. By the way, it has a name. I call him Veerabhadra. My bullet is called Veerabhadran. So Veerabhadran has been taking me to a lot of places. I think most of Tamil Nadu I covered on my bike. So
right,
that's it. Yeah,
it's been an absolute pleasure, Srinath. I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed this. I think there's much that we covered, but there's much that we uncovered also. And I think there is much more for us to go over as well. So perhaps we'll need to do another conversation if at all. But it's been an absolute pleasure. I want to thank you on behalf of the Swami Vivekananda Youth Movement, the Vivekananda Institute for Leadership, Education and Development. And I also want to take this opportunity to thank all the participants who came here, sat with us and, been with us. So continue to keep coming. This happens every Saturday, 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. It's live on Zoom. It's also streamed live on YouTube. Next week, we'll have a very interesting person. He's a local Mysorean, Lokesh Narasimhachar, who runs a place called Cyclopedia. So he's been working on promoting cycling in across the country, not just Mysore. So we will have him. And thank you once again. Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend. And thank you, Srinath. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Ramesh. Thank you for hosting me. Really pleasure talking to you.
Bye.